My name is Tobias Nakamura Reed. I'm a diplomat who survived the first 30 days of the Ice Age apocalypse. When Yellowstone erupted and ash blocked out the sun, I watched Denver freeze solid in 6 weeks. I had to choose between finding my missing daughter or keeping my survivor group alive. My negotiation skills that once prevented wars between nations became the only thing standing between my people and death. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Tobias Nakamura Reed, and I need to tell you what really happened during those first 30 days of the Ice Age apocalypse. If you're watching this transmission, you're probably facing the same impossible choice I did back then. Stay where you are and slowly freeze to death, or risk everything you have left to head south into the unknown. I'm broadcasting this from what used to be called the safe zone, but I'll get to that later. Right now, you need to understand how it all began, because the signs were there from the very beginning if you knew how to read them. I was a State Department Foreign Service officer for 15 years before the world ended. My specialty was conflict resolution, specifically territorial disputes and refugee crises. I'd spent the better part of my career in places like Southeast Asia and Latin America, mediating between governments that couldn't agree on where their borders should be drawn or how to handle massive population movements. I speak Japanese fluently thanks to my mother's side of the family, conversational Spanish from my years in Colombia, and enough Arabic to get by in a crisis. My father was Irish American, which gave me the stubborn streak that probably kept me alive during those first weeks when everything fell apart. The irony wasn't lost on me later. I'd spent my entire adult life preparing for conflicts between nations, learning how to negotiate when millions of lives hung in the balance, studying mass population movements and resource distribution during humanitarian crises. I thought I was an expert on human displacement. I had no idea I was actually training for the day when the entire planet would become uninhabitable and every person on Earth would become a refugee. On October 15th, I was standing in the main terminal of Denver International Airport at 2:30 in the afternoon. I remember the exact time because I was checking my watch, annoyed that my flight back to Washington was delayed again. I just finished a 3-day mediation session between Colorado and Nebraska over water rights along the South Platte River. It sounds mundane now, but back then, those kinds of disputes could escalate into serious interstate conflicts. Two state governments, millions of people affected, agricultural economies on both sides depending on the outcome. It was exactly the kind of work I lived for. The temperature outside was nearly 70 degrees, which should have been the first warning sign. October in Denver is supposed to be crisp, with leaves changing colors and that first hint of winter in the air. Instead, it felt like late summer. People were walking around in t-shirts and shorts, talking about how nice the weather was, how global warming might not be so bad after all. I remember thinking how naive that sounded, but I kept those thoughts to myself. My job was diplomacy, not climate science. My phone started buzzing at 2:47. Emergency alerts, one after another. Yellowstone National Park. Massive volcanic eruption. All aircraft grounded immediately. I looked around the terminal and saw hundreds of other people getting the same alerts, their faces shifting from confusion to concern to outright fear in the span of about 30 seconds. The first news reports were chaotic. Nobody really understood what was happening. Yellowstone was over 400 miles away from Denver, which seemed like a safe distance until you realized that volcanic ash doesn't respect geographical boundaries. The early footage showed this enormous pillar of ash and smoke rising from the park, but it looked almost peaceful on the small phone screens, like a distant thunderstorm that would pass over and leave everything clean. I dealt with enough natural disasters in my diplomatic career to know that the first reports are always wrong. Earthquakes that initially seem minor turn out to have leveled entire cities. Hurricanes that look manageable on satellite imagery end up displacing millions of people. The key is to look for the information that authorities aren't sharing yet, the details they're keeping quiet while they figure out how bad things really are. Within an hour, I noticed that all flights weren't just delayed, they were canceled indefinitely. Not just out of Denver, but across the entire western United States. That told me this wasn't a temporary problem. When you ground that many aircraft simultaneously, you're dealing with something that affects airspace across multiple states. I tried calling my daughter Keiko that evening from my hotel room. She was doing graduate research in atmospheric science at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, part of an international program studying climate change indicators. The call went straight to voicemail, which wasn't unusual given the time difference, but something about her outgoing message stuck with me. She'd recorded it just a few days earlier, and she sounded excited about some new data her team was collecting. She mentioned something about unusual atmospheric readings that didn't match any of their climate models. At the time, I figured it was just typical graduate student enthusiasm for their research project. I couldn't have known that her team was probably among the first scientists to detect the massive changes in atmospheric composition that were already beginning. The volcanic ash wasn't just blocking sunlight locally around Yellowstone. It was being carried by high-altitude winds across the entire northern hemisphere, creating a barrier between the sun and the Earth's surface that would fundamentally alter global weather patterns for years to come. By the second day, the ash started falling in Denver like gray snow. At first, people treated it like a novelty. Kids were playing in it. Adults were taking pictures to post on social media. The news reports were calling it a temporary inconvenience, comparing it to the Mount St. Helens eruption back in 1980. They kept saying the ash would settle in a few days and everything would return to normal. But I'd seen enough refugee camps to recognize the signs of a system under stress. The grocery stores were already running low on bottled water and canned goods. Gas stations had lines of cars stretching for blocks. The airport wasn't just closed, it was completely shut down with no timeline for reopening. These weren't the patterns you see during a temporary emergency. These were the early stages of societal breakdown. I started keeping a detailed journal on day 2, partly out of habit from my diplomatic work, and partly because I had a growing sense that someone needed to document what was really happening. My government training had taught me to pay attention to the details that everyone else was ignoring, to spot the early warning signs of conflicts before they escalated into violence. The temperature dropped 8 degrees on the second day, 12 degrees on the third day. By the fourth day, it was snowing in downtown Denver in mid-October, and the snow wasn't melting. The sun was still visible during the day, but it looked dim and orange through the ash cloud, like looking at a light bulb through a dirty window. I tried reaching my contacts at the State Department, but the communication systems were overwhelmed. The few calls that went through were brief and unhelpful. Everyone was dealing with their own crisis, trying to coordinate responses to what was being called the largest natural disaster in American history. But I could hear something in their voices that told me they were more worried than they were letting on publicly. On day 4, I managed to get through to a colleague at the National Security Council who'd worked with me on several international crisis responses. He couldn't say much over an unsecured line, but he told me that the volcanic eruption was unlike anything in recorded history. The amount of ash being ejected into the atmosphere was comparable to some of the massive eruptions that had caused global climate changes in the geological past. He used the phrase nuclear winter scenario and then quickly changed the subject. That's when I understood that this wasn't going to be a temporary inconvenience. The ash cloud was going to block sunlight for months, possibly years. Global temperatures were going to drop significantly. Agricultural systems would fail. Supply chains would collapse. Governments would struggle to maintain order as millions of people realized that their homes were becoming uninhabitable. I started making preparations that night. My diplomatic training had included survival courses, basic emergency preparedness, the kind of skills you need when you're representing American interests in unstable regions. I had a motorcycle with modifications for long-distance travel, survival gear rated for extreme weather conditions, and enough emergency supplies to last several weeks if necessary. Most importantly, I had experience dealing with population movements during humanitarian crises. I also had something that most people didn't have anymore. I knew how to negotiate with people under extreme stress, how to build trust quickly in desperate situations, how to organize groups of strangers into functional communities. Those skills had served me well in refugee camps and disaster zones around the world. I was about to find out how well they would work when the disaster zone was my own country. On day 5, the power grid started having problems. Rolling blackouts, voltage fluctuations, entire neighborhoods losing electricity for hours at a time. The official explanation was that increased heating demand was straining the system, but I suspected the real problem was that the ash was interfering with power generation and transmission systems across the region. I spent that day walking around downtown Denver, observing how people were adapting to the crisis. The patterns were familiar from my international work, but seeing them play out in an American city was surreal. People were forming informal groups based on where they lived or worked, sharing resources and information. Some were hoarding supplies, others were trying to help their neighbors. The social fabric was holding together, but I could see the stress fractures beginning to form. That evening, I managed to get into a government briefing at the federal building. My diplomatic credentials still carried some weight, and the local emergency management officials were grateful to have someone with international crisis experience available. What I learned in that briefing changed everything. The Yellowstone eruption wasn't a single event. It was an ongoing process that could continue for weeks or months. The ash cloud was spreading across the entire northern hemisphere, and satellite data showed that global temperatures were already dropping in regions where the ash coverage was heaviest. Agricultural areas across the Midwest were reporting crop failures. International shipping was being disrupted as ports dealt with ash contamination. More importantly, the federal government was quietly beginning to plan for mass population movements. They were identifying southern regions that might remain habitable, establishing what they called climate resilience zones, where they could concentrate resources and maintain some level of governmental function. But they weren't sharing this information with the public yet because they were afraid of triggering panic and uncontrolled population movements. I left that briefing knowing two things for certain. First, the government was planning to abandon large portions of the northern United States, including Denver. Second, they weren't going to tell people the truth until they had no choice, which meant that by the time they started official evacuations, it would be too late for most people to get out safely. On day 6, I made the decision that probably saved my life and the lives of everyone who would eventually join my group. I started organizing, not just for my own survival, but for the survival of anyone who was smart enough to listen and brave enough to act on information that contradicted everything the authorities were telling us. I began by identifying people at my hotel who had useful skills and seemed capable of making hard decisions under pressure. There was Maria, a trauma nurse from Denver General who'd been stranded at the airport and ended up at the same hotel. She understood medical triage, how to allocate scarce resources when you can't save everyone. There was Carlos, a mechanic who specialized in cold weather vehicle modifications. He knew how to keep machines running in extreme conditions. There was the Henderson family, parents with 2 teenage kids who'd been traveling through Denver when the eruption happened. They had camping and outdoor survival experience. I started these conversations carefully, using the same techniques I'd used when building coalitions between different factions in international negotiations. I didn't lead with the worst-case scenarios or try to frighten people into cooperation. Instead, I focused on practical problems we were all facing: how to stay warm when the power was unreliable, how to obtain food when the supply chains were disrupted, how to stay informed when the official information was clearly incomplete. By the end of day 6, I had the core of what would become our survival group. 8 people who trusted each other enough to share resources and make decisions collectively. More importantly, I had people who understood that the situation we were facing was unprecedented and that conventional responses weren't going to be adequate. That night, I tried calling Keiko again. This time, I got through to her voicemail, and her message had changed. She sounded worried, talking about atmospheric readings that were completely outside normal parameters, and mentioning that her research team was being consulted by government agencies about long-term climate impacts. She asked me to call her back as soon as possible and said she had important information to share. I never got the chance to call her back. The next morning, international phone lines were down across most of the United States, and they would stay down for weeks. But her message told me everything I needed to know. The atmospheric scientists had figured out what was happening before anyone else, and they were scared. As I settled in for what I knew would be the last normal night of sleep I'd have for a very long time, I thought about all the refugee situations I'd dealt with in my diplomatic career. The people who'd waited too long to leave their homes, who'd trusted their governments to protect them, who'd believed that help was coming right up until the moment when it became clear that no help was coming. I wasn't going to make that mistake. Tomorrow, I would start preparing my group for a journey south, toward regions that might remain habitable. I would use every negotiation skill I'd learned, every crisis management technique I'd mastered, every piece of knowledge I'd gained about human behavior under extreme stress. But first, I had to convince them that everything we'd been told about this crisis was wrong, that we weren't dealing with a temporary emergency that would be resolved by competent authorities. We were dealing with a fundamental change in the planet's climate system, and our survival depended on accepting that reality and adapting to it before it was too late. The Ice Age had begun, and we were on our own. By day 7, I knew the government briefings were lies. The officials who'd been reassuring us were quietly evacuating their own families south. I watched a convoy of black SUVs leave the federal building at 3 in the morning, loaded with personnel and equipment heading toward the interstate. When I asked about it at the next briefing, they told me it was a routine transfer of non-essential staff. But I'd seen enough covert operations to recognize an evacuation when I saw one. The power grid collapsed that morning across most of Colorado. Not rolling blackouts this time, but complete system failure. The official explanation was equipment damage from ash accumulation, but I suspected they were deliberately shutting down infrastructure they couldn't maintain. When governments start abandoning their own facilities, you know they've moved from crisis management to damage control. I called our group together in the hotel conference room that evening. 8 people sitting around a table lit by emergency candles, trying to make sense of a situation that was changing faster than any of us could process. Maria had been working double shifts at the hospital before it closed, and she looked exhausted. The Henderson kids, Sarah and Michael, were trying to act like this was all some kind of adventure, but I could see the fear in their eyes. Carlos had been monitoring radio traffic from emergency services, and what he was hearing wasn't encouraging. I laid out everything I knew. The government was planning to abandon Denver and most of the northern states. The ash cloud was causing global temperature drops that could last for years. Agricultural systems were failing across the Midwest. International supply chains had essentially stopped functioning. Most importantly, there were no rescue operations planned for civilian populations in what they were calling the impact zones. The hardest part was explaining that we were looking at a fundamental change in Earth's climate system, not a temporary disaster. People are conditioned to think that emergencies have beginnings, middles, and ends. Earthquakes last minutes, hurricanes last days. Even wars eventually end. But what we were facing was a shift to a new baseline that could persist for decades. Sarah Henderson, who was 16 and probably smarter than the rest of us combined, asked the question that everyone was thinking. How long did we have before staying in Denver became impossible? I told her the truth. Based on the temperature drops we'd already seen and the continued ash fallout, I estimated we had maybe 2 weeks before the infrastructure failures became irreversible, and maybe a month before the cold became lethal for anyone without specialized survival equipment. That's when I made the decision that would define everything that came after. I told them we were going to form a survival community based on the same principles I'd used in international negotiations: consensus decision-making, resource sharing, and collective responsibility for everyone's welfare. But I also told them that unlike my diplomatic work, this wasn't about preventing conflict between existing powers. This was about building something entirely new. Carlos had found a working radio setup in the hotel's communication room. It was designed for business communications, but with some modifications, he could tune into emergency frequencies and even some international channels. That's how we learned that the crisis was global. Ash clouds were affecting weather patterns across Europe and Asia. Crop failures were being reported from Canada to Russia. Governments were implementing emergency protocols that sounded suspiciously like martial law. More disturbing were the reports from other American cities. Kansas City had lost power completely. Chicago was dealing with massive population movements as people tried to head south. The interstate highway system was becoming clogged with abandoned vehicles as people ran out of fuel or their cars broke down in the increasingly harsh conditions. But we also picked up signals that gave me hope. Ham radio operators were coordinating information between survivor groups across the country. Some communities were successfully organizing resource sharing and mutual aid networks. There were reports of towns in the southern states that were establishing themselves as refugee processing centers, places where people fleeing the northern regions could find temporary shelter and assistance. I started monitoring these communications every evening after our group meetings. My language skills proved useful because some of the clearest information was coming from international sources. Mexican radio stations were reporting massive refugee movements along their northern border. Canadian broadcasts described entire cities being evacuated as the Arctic front pushed south faster than anyone had predicted. On day 8, we had our first real test as a group. Another family showed up at our hotel, the Kowalskis, Polish immigrants who'd been visiting Denver when the eruption happened. They had a 6-year-old daughter and limited English, but they were clearly desperate. Their car had broken down. They'd spent their last money on a hotel room that they couldn't afford for another night, and they had no idea how to navigate the increasingly chaotic situation. This was exactly the kind of decision I'd faced countless times in refugee camps. Limited resources, people in genuine need, and the knowledge that helping one group might compromise your ability to help others. The difference was that this time, I wasn't representing a government with established protocols and unlimited resources. I was part of a small group that had to make decisions based on what we could actually afford to do. I called a group meeting to discuss whether to invite the Kowalskis to join us. The conversation revealed a lot about who we were becoming as a community. Maria immediately said we had to help them, especially because of the child. Carlos was worried about stretching our resources too thin. The Hendersons were divided, with the parents concerned about security and the teenagers arguing for inclusion. I used every mediation technique I knew to guide that discussion. I made sure everyone had a chance to speak, that we examined the issue from multiple perspectives, and that we focused on our shared values rather than just the immediate practical concerns. After 2 hours of careful negotiation, we reached consensus. We would invite the Kowalskis to join us, but with clear expectations about resource sharing and decision-making responsibilities. That decision changed our group dynamics in ways I hadn't anticipated. The Kowalskis brought skills we didn't have. Anna was a nurse practitioner, which gave us additional medical capabilities. Stefan had worked in logistics for an international shipping company and understood supply chain management. Little Emma, despite being only 6, spoke 3 languages and could translate between the adults when communication was difficult. More importantly, integrating them into our group forced us to develop systems for incorporating new members, for sharing information across language barriers, and for making decisions that affected people with very different backgrounds and perspectives. These weren't just survival skills. They were the foundation of community building, the same principles that would later prove essential when we encountered other survivor groups. On day 9, we made contact with what we started calling the Council. This was a loose network of survivor groups that had formed across Denver, connected by radio communications and coordinated resource sharing. The idea had emerged spontaneously from several different communities, but it was based on principles that I recognized from international peacekeeping operations. Each group maintained its autonomy and internal decision-making processes, but they coordinated on larger issues that affected everyone. Information sharing about safe routes and dangerous areas. Organizing supply runs to abandoned stores and warehouses. Most importantly, they were trying to prevent conflicts between different survivor communities by establishing protocols for resolving disputes peacefully. I volunteered our group to participate in the council partly because I believed in the concept, and partly because I recognized that our survival might depend on being part of a larger network. Small groups are vulnerable in ways that larger communities aren't. But I also saw an opportunity to apply my diplomatic training to help build something that could outlast the immediate crisis. The first council meeting I attended was held in the basement of a downtown church. Representatives from 12 different survivor groups, maybe 40 people total, trying to figure out how to govern themselves in a situation where all the traditional authorities had either disappeared or become irrelevant. It was like watching the formation of a new government in real time. People were proposing different systems for resource allocation, different approaches to security, different methods for making collective decisions. Some wanted strict hierarchy and central planning. Others insisted on complete autonomy for each group. A few were advocating for something that sounded suspiciously like warlordism. I spent most of that meeting listening, trying to understand the different factions and their motivations. This was exactly the kind of situation I'd trained for, except instead of negotiating between nation-states with established interests and historical grievances, I was mediating between neighbors who'd never had to think about governance before. By the end of the meeting, we'd established some basic principles. The council would coordinate information and resources, but wouldn't interfere with individual group decision-making. We would try to resolve disputes through mediation before resorting to force. Most importantly, we would work together to plan for long-term survival, including the possibility that we might need to evacuate Denver entirely. That last point was controversial. Several groups insisted that government assistance would arrive eventually, that we just needed to hold out until the crisis passed. Others were already planning to head south independently. I found myself in the middle, arguing that we needed to prepare for multiple scenarios while keeping our options open as long as possible. On day 10, we got our first concrete evidence that the situation was worse than even the pessimists had imagined. Carlos intercepted a military communication about Operation Southern Shield, which seemed to be a plan for establishing defensible perimeters around southern cities to control refugee movements. The language was clinical and bureaucratic, but the implications were terrifying. The government wasn't planning to evacuate people from the northern states. They were planning to prevent them from reaching the southern states. I'd seen similar policies during international humanitarian crises. When refugee populations become too large for host communities to absorb, governments start implementing what they call containment strategies. The official justification is always about maintaining order and preventing chaos. The reality is that they're writing off entire populations as expendable. That night, I tried again to reach Keiko through the international radio networks. I'd been monitoring the frequencies that universities used for research communications, hoping to pick up something from her team in Scotland. What I heard instead was a fragmentary transmission from a research station in Greenland, reporting that the Greenland ice sheet was showing signs of accelerated growth for the first time in recorded history. The implications were staggering. If global temperatures were dropping fast enough to reverse ice sheet melting, we weren't looking at a temporary climate disruption. We were looking at the beginning of a new ice age, a fundamental shift in Earth's climate system that could last for centuries. I didn't share this information with our group immediately. They were already dealing with enough uncertainty, and I needed time to think through what it meant for our survival strategy. But it reinforced my growing conviction that we couldn't wait for conditions to improve or for government assistance to arrive. We needed to start planning our exodus from Denver immediately. Day 11 brought our first casualty, not from our group, but from the broader community we were becoming part of. An elderly man from one of the other council groups died from hypothermia during the night. The temperature had dropped below freezing again, and his group didn't have adequate heating in their shelter. The funeral was held in the same church basement where we'd had our first council meeting. It was a simple ceremony, but it served as a stark reminder of what we were all facing. The margin between survival and death was getting thinner every day, and winter hadn't even officially started yet. That evening, we held our own group meeting to discuss what we'd learned from the man's death. Maria explained the medical realities of hypothermia, how it progresses, and what signs to watch for. Carlos talked about heating systems and fuel conservation. The Hendersons shared techniques for cold weather camping and survival. But the most important part of that conversation was when little Emma asked why the government wasn't helping people stay warm. It was an innocent question from a 6-year-old, but it forced us to confront the reality that we were truly on our own. The government wasn't coming to save us. International aid organizations weren't going to establish refugee camps in Denver. We were responsible for our own survival and the survival of anyone we chose to help. On day 12, I made the decision to start planning our evacuation from Denver, not immediately but soon. The signs were all pointing in the same direction. The infrastructure was failing faster than it could be repaired. The temperature was continuing to drop. Most importantly, the government was clearly preparing to abandon the northern states entirely. I called a special group meeting to present what I was calling our Southern strategy. The basic concept was simple. We would establish contact with survivor communities in the southern states, identify potential destinations where we could relocate, and plan multiple routes that would get us there safely. We would coordinate with the council to share information and resources, but we wouldn't wait for collective decision-making if time became critical. The reaction was mixed. Some people were relieved to hear that we were planning ahead. Others were resistant to the idea of leaving Denver permanently. The Kowalskis were particularly conflicted because they'd originally planned to return to Poland, but international travel was no longer possible. I spent the next several hours using every negotiation technique I'd learned to build consensus around the Southern strategy. I didn't try to convince people that it was the only option. Instead, I focused on the idea that planning gave us choices, that we could always decide not to use the plans we made, but that not having plans meant we'd be forced to make desperate decisions under crisis conditions. By the end of that meeting, we'd agreed to start gathering information about southern destinations and potential routes. We would continue participating in the council and supporting the broader Denver survivor community, but we would also prepare for the possibility that staying wasn't viable long-term. That night, I finally managed to pick up a clear transmission on one of the research frequencies. It wasn't from Keiko, but it was from a climate research station in Antarctica. They were reporting unprecedented changes in global atmospheric circulation patterns. The volcanic ash was interacting with natural climate systems in ways that were accelerating the cooling process. More importantly, they were estimating that global average temperatures could drop by 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit over the next 2 to 3 years. That would make most of the northern United States uninhabitable without constant artificial heating. Even the southern states would experience winter conditions unlike anything in recorded history. I sat in that hotel room, listening to scientists on the other side of the world describe the end of the climate system that had supported human civilization for the past 10,000 years, and I realized that everything I thought I knew about crisis management was inadequate. I'd spent my career dealing with conflicts between human beings. Now I was facing a conflict between human beings and the planet itself. But I also realized that the skills I'd developed, the experience I'd gained, and the networks I'd built were exactly what we needed to survive this new reality. Diplomacy isn't just about preventing wars between countries. It's about building trust between strangers, finding common ground between different perspectives, and creating systems that allow people to cooperate even when they have conflicting interests. Over the next 18 days, those skills would be tested in ways I'd never imagined. We would face decisions that no diplomatic training could prepare you for, conflicts that couldn't be resolved through negotiation, and challenges that would force us to choose between our principles and our survival. But on day 12, sitting in that hotel room in Denver, listening to radio transmissions from around the world, I felt something I hadn't felt since the volcano erupted. I felt hope. Not that things would return to normal, but that we could adapt to the new normal, that we could build something better than what we'd lost. The ice age was accelerating, and we were running out of time to escape its reach. I made the call to tell our group about the safe zones on day 13. I thought I was giving them hope. Instead, I nearly got us all killed. The information had come through the council's radio network the night before. A ham radio operator in Colorado Springs had intercepted military communications about something called Southern Resilience Zones. Government facilities being established in Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico, where they were concentrating resources and maintaining infrastructure. The transmission mentioned processing centers for refugees, but it also talked about capacity limits and screening procedures. I should have been more careful about how I shared this information. In my diplomatic work, I'd learned that hope can be as dangerous as despair if people act on it without proper planning. But our group had been living with uncertainty for almost 2 weeks, and the promise of government assistance was exactly what they wanted to hear. Sarah Henderson was the first to say what everyone was thinking. If there were safe zones being established in the South, we needed to get there as soon as possible before they reached capacity. Michael, her younger brother, started talking about which route would be fastest. Even Anna Kowalski, who'd been the most cautious about making major decisions, seemed convinced that heading south immediately was our best option. I tried to explain that we needed more information before making such a drastic move. The radio transmission had been fragmentary, and we didn't know crucial details about how these safe zones operated or whether civilians would actually be admitted. But the group dynamic had already shifted. They'd made up their minds, and my diplomatic training told me that trying to override their consensus would fracture our community. So I did what I'd learned to do in international negotiations when I disagreed with the direction things were heading. I worked to shape the decision rather than oppose it. If we were going to attempt an evacuation, we would do it properly. We would plan multiple routes, prepare for various contingencies, and maintain communication with the council so other groups could learn from our experience. We spent day 13 and 14 in intensive preparation. Carlos worked on winterizing our vehicles and calculating fuel requirements for different routes. Maria assembled medical supplies and prepared for treating cold weather injuries during travel. The Hendersons shared their camping expertise and helped us identify essential survival gear. I focused on route planning and risk assessment. Interstate 25 south toward New Mexico seemed like the obvious choice, but it would also be the route that everyone else would take. Highway 50 toward Kansas offered more alternatives, but would take us through areas that might already be experiencing severe weather. The mountain routes were shorter but potentially impassable if conditions deteriorated further. We decided on a modified version of the Interstate 25 route. We would head southeast toward Pueblo, then take smaller highways through the eastern plains toward the Texas border. It would take longer, but we'd avoid the major population centers where traffic jams and resource conflicts were most likely. On the morning of day 15, we loaded everything we owned into 3 vehicles and prepared to leave Denver permanently. It was a moment I'll never forget, saying goodbye to a place that had been home, even temporarily, and heading into complete uncertainty. But it was also a moment of unity for our group. Whatever happened next, we would face it together. The first sign of trouble came before we'd even reached the city limits. The roads were packed with other vehicles heading south, all loaded with families and supplies. Traffic that should have been moving at highway speeds was crawling at maybe 10 miles per hour. Worse, we could see abandoned cars scattered along the shoulders, vehicles that had broken down or run out of fuel and been left behind. By midday, we'd traveled less than 50 miles and were stuck in a massive traffic jam near Castle Rock. The temperature was dropping, snow was beginning to fall, and our fuel consumption was much higher than we'd calculated because of the stop-and-go traffic. I started doing mental calculations about our remaining fuel and realized we might not have enough to reach the Texas border even if the traffic cleared immediately. That's when I made one of the hardest decisions of those first 30 days. I used my motorcycle to scout ahead and see if there were alternate routes we could take. What I found was worse than the traffic jam we were stuck in. The main highway was completely blocked about 20 miles ahead, where a multi-car accident had closed all lanes. Emergency services weren't responding because they'd been overwhelmed with similar incidents across the region. I rode back to our vehicles and called an emergency group meeting right there on the side of the highway. I told them what I'd seen and explained our options. We could abandon the vehicles and try to continue on foot, but that would mean leaving behind most of our supplies in increasingly dangerous weather conditions. We could try to find an alternate route, but that would require backtracking, and we might not have enough fuel. Or we could return to Denver and wait for better conditions. The discussion that followed was the most difficult negotiation I'd ever been part of. Everyone understood the stakes, but we had fundamentally different assessments of the risks involved. Maria argued that continuing on foot was suicidal in the weather conditions we were facing. Carlos insisted that the vehicles could be modified to handle alternate routes if we were willing to take the time. Stefan Kowalski wanted to try joining other groups to pool resources for a larger convoy. While we were talking, the situation around us was deteriorating rapidly. The snow was getting heavier, visibility was decreasing, and other stranded travelers were becoming increasingly desperate. I watched groups of people abandoning their vehicles and setting out on foot with inadequate supplies and clothing. Some were trying to break into other people's cars to steal fuel or supplies. That's when I understood something crucial about mass population movements that I'd never fully grasped during my diplomatic career. Individual rational decisions can create collectively catastrophic outcomes. Everyone fleeing Denver was making reasonable choices about their own survival, but the aggregate effect was creating conditions that made survival impossible for almost everyone. I called for a final group decision. We would return to Denver, not because it was safe, but because attempting to continue south under these conditions was almost certainly fatal. We would regroup, gather more information, and plan a better approach. Most importantly, we would share what we'd learned with the council so other groups could avoid making the same mistakes. The journey back to Denver took almost as long as the journey out had taken. The roads were still clogged with vehicles, but now they were heading in both directions as other groups reached the same conclusion we had. Some people were turning back, others were continuing south despite the conditions, and a few were simply abandoning their vehicles and trying to survive wherever they were. We made it back to our hotel after dark on day 15, exhausted and demoralized but alive. The building was no longer heated, but it still provided shelter from the wind and snow. More importantly, it was a known location where other council members could find us if necessary. That night, I held individual conversations with each member of our group. Not formal meetings, but one-on-one discussions about how they were handling the stress and what they thought our next steps should be. This was a technique I'd learned during peacekeeping operations, when group dynamics became too complex for collective decision-making. What I learned was that our failed evacuation attempt had actually strengthened our group cohesion in some ways. Everyone had seen how dangerous the situation outside Denver had become, and they appreciated having a stable community to return to. But it had also revealed some fundamental disagreements about risk assessment and decision-making that we needed to address. Sarah Henderson, who at 16 was often more perceptive than the adults, made an observation that changed how I thought about our situation. She pointed out that we were trying to solve an individual problem with group solutions. Each person in our group had different priorities, different risk tolerances, and different ideas about what constituted success. Trying to make collective decisions that satisfied everyone was preventing us from making any effective decisions at all. On day 16, I proposed a new approach to our group planning. Instead of trying to reach consensus on major decisions, we would develop multiple contingency plans that individuals could choose between based on their own circumstances and priorities. We would share resources and information, but we wouldn't require everyone to make the same choices about their survival strategy. This was actually a common approach in international refugee situations, where aid organizations provide multiple options for displaced populations, rather than trying to implement one-size-fits-all solutions. But it was emotionally difficult for our group, because it meant accepting that we might not all stay together permanently. The conversation about this new approach took most of the day and involved some of the most difficult negotiations I'd ever facilitated. People were afraid that splitting up would weaken everyone's survival chances. They were also afraid that committing to group decisions would trap them in strategies that didn't match their individual needs. By evening, we'd reached a compromise that satisfied most people's concerns. We would continue operating as a unified group for resource sharing and mutual support, but individuals could opt out of specific plans if they had compelling reasons. More importantly, we would help people pursue their individual survival strategies even if we disagreed with their choices. On day 17, we received radio contact from a group that called itself the Southern Network. These were survivor communities that had formed along the Texas-New Mexico border, and they were offering to coordinate with northern groups about evacuation procedures and resource sharing. The information they provided was both encouraging and disturbing. The southern states were indeed establishing refugee processing centers, but they were also implementing strict controls on population movements to prevent overcrowding. People were being required to demonstrate that they had skills or resources that would contribute to the southern communities before being granted permanent settlement. More concerning was their report about conditions along the major evacuation routes. Interstate highways were becoming impassable due to abandoned vehicles and weather conditions. Smaller roads were being blocked by local communities trying to prevent refugees from passing through their areas. Some groups had turned to raiding abandoned vehicles and settlements for supplies. This information forced us to completely reconsider our evacuation planning. Simply heading south wasn't enough. We needed to identify specific destinations where we would be welcome, establish contact with those communities in advance, and plan routes that avoided areas where refugees were being turned away or attacked. I spent that evening developing what I called our diplomatic evacuation strategy. Instead of fleeing as refugees, we would approach Southern communities as potential partners, offering skills and resources in exchange for settlement opportunities. I would use my diplomatic credentials and experience to negotiate agreements before we attempted to travel. On day 18, we made our first successful contact with a specific Southern community. It was a town called Esperanza in South Texas that had been designated as a refugee processing center by the state government. The local authorities were looking for people with specific skills to help manage the influx of evacuees and maintain essential services. Maria's medical training made her an immediately valuable candidate. Carlos's mechanical skills were desperately needed for vehicle maintenance and infrastructure repair. My diplomatic experience was relevant for refugee processing and conflict resolution. Even the Henderson kids were attractive to the community because they had camping and outdoor skills that were useful for managing temporary settlements. The negotiations took 3 days and involved multiple radio conversations with different officials in Esperanza. I had to provide detailed information about our group's composition, skills, and resources. We had to agree to specific contributions we would make to the community upon arrival. Most importantly, we had to demonstrate that we had the means to travel to Texas independently without requiring rescue or assistance. By day 21, we had formal agreements with 3 different Southern communities that would accept our group as permanent residents. This gave us options and backup plans if our first choice didn't work out. It also provided us with specific destinations and contact information for people who were expecting us. But we also learned something that fundamentally changed our understanding of the broader situation. The Southern Network wasn't just coordinating refugee resettlement. They were essentially forming a new confederation of independent communities that were planning to govern themselves separately from whatever remained of the federal government. This wasn't just a humanitarian crisis or a natural disaster. It was the beginning of a fundamental reorganization of political authority in North America. The northern states were being abandoned not just by individuals and families, but by governmental institutions themselves. The southern communities were filling the resulting power vacuum by creating their own systems of governance and resource allocation. I realized that my diplomatic skills weren't just useful for immediate survival. They were preparation for whatever new political arrangements would emerge from this crisis. The experience I'd gained in international negotiations, conflict resolution, and treaty making could be crucial for helping to establish stable governance systems in the post-collapse communities. On day 22, we received disturbing news from the Council radio network. Several survivor groups in Denver had been raided by other groups looking for supplies. The attacks had been coordinated and systematic, suggesting that some communities were transitioning from cooperative resource sharing to predatory resource acquisition. This news forced another difficult group discussion about our security situation. We'd been operating under the assumption that the Council network provided mutual protection and that most survivor groups were committed to cooperative principles. But it was becoming clear that resource scarcity was driving some groups toward increasingly desperate measures. I proposed that we accelerate our evacuation timeline and leave Denver within the week. The conditions we'd encountered during our first attempt had probably improved as fewer people were attempting to travel south. More importantly, staying in Denver was becoming more dangerous than attempting the journey. The group agreed, but with conditions. We would travel in convoy with other council groups to provide mutual security. We would maintain radio contact with both the council and the Southern network throughout our journey. Most importantly, we would be prepared to turn back if conditions became too dangerous. We spent the next 3 days in final preparations. Carlos modified our vehicles for better cold weather performance and installed additional fuel capacity. Maria assembled comprehensive medical supplies, and trained everyone in basic first aid procedures. I established detailed communication protocols with our contacts in Texas and prepared documentation that would help us prove our identities and agreements upon arrival. On the evening of day 24, I tried one more time to make contact with Keiko through the international radio networks. I'd been monitoring university frequencies and research communications, hoping to hear something from her team in Scotland or get information about evacuation procedures for American citizens in Europe. What I heard instead was a transmission from a research station in Norway reporting that the North Atlantic Ocean current system was showing signs of disruption. This was the system that kept Europe's climate moderate despite its northern latitude. If it collapsed, Europe would experience the same dramatic cooling that we were seeing in North America. The implications were staggering. Keiko and millions of other people were facing the same crisis we were, but with fewer options for evacuation to warmer regions. Europe didn't have vast southern territories that could serve as refuge areas. If the climate disruption was truly global, there might be no safe zones anywhere on the planet. I didn't share this information with our group. They were already dealing with enough uncertainty about their own situation, and there was nothing we could do to help people on other continents. But it reinforced my conviction that we needed to focus on immediate survival and building resilient communities rather than hoping for external rescue or assistance. That night, as I packed my personal belongings for what I knew would be our final departure from Denver, I thought about all the international crises I'd worked on during my diplomatic career. Refugee movements, resource conflicts, governmental collapses, ethnic tensions. I'd always approached these situations as an outside observer trying to help other people solve their problems. Now I was living inside one of those crises, and I understood things about mass displacement and social breakdown that no amount of professional training could have taught me. The difference between theoretical knowledge and lived experience was the difference between reading about hypothermia and actually freezing to death. But I also understood something else. The skills that had made me effective as a diplomat, the experience I'd gained in building trust between strangers and mediating conflicts between desperate people, were exactly what the world needed now. Not to prevent wars between nation-states, but to help communities survive the collapse of the systems that had supported human civilization. Tomorrow, we would leave Denver for the last time and begin the journey toward whatever new world was emerging from the ruins of the old one. By day 19, I realized my old job was preparing for wars between nations. Now I was preventing wars between neighbors over a can of beans. The transformation of the council from a cooperative network into something resembling a provisional government happened faster than any of us had anticipated. What started as informal resource sharing between survivor groups had evolved into complex negotiations about territory, security, and the distribution of increasingly scarce supplies. I found myself spending more time mediating disputes between different communities than planning our own evacuation. The catalyst was the discovery of a large cache of medical supplies in an abandoned hospital on the north side of Denver. 3 different survivor groups claimed salvage rights to the facility, and the disagreement escalated quickly from verbal arguments to armed confrontations. This wasn't just about the immediate value of the supplies. It was about establishing precedents for how resources would be allocated as the crisis deepened. I volunteered to lead the mediation team partly because I had experience with territorial disputes, and partly because I understood that our group's survival might depend on maintaining the council's stability. If the network collapsed into competing factions, small groups like ours would be vulnerable to predation from larger, more aggressive communities. The negotiation took place in the same church basement where we'd held our first council meeting, but the atmosphere was completely different. Instead of frightened neighbors trying to help each other, we were dealing with hardened representatives who saw cooperation as weakness and compromise as defeat. The stakes had escalated from survival to control. The three groups involved were the Northside Coalition, a well-armed community of about 60 people led by a former military contractor named Jackson. The Medical District Group, which included several healthcare workers who argued they had the expertise to properly distribute the supplies. And the Family Alliance, a collection of households with young children who claimed they had the greatest need for medical resources. Each group presented compelling arguments. Jackson's people had the manpower and weapons to secure the hospital facility against raiders. The medical professionals could ensure the supplies were used effectively rather than wasted. The families with children faced the highest mortality rates if medical care wasn't available. But underlying each argument was a deeper question about what kind of society we were building from the ruins of the old one. Were we going to operate according to might makes right principles where the strongest groups controlled resources? Would technical expertise determine distribution decisions? Or would we prioritize the most vulnerable members of our community regardless of their ability to contribute? I spent the first 2 hours of that negotiation just listening, trying to understand not just what each group wanted, but why they felt their approach was the only viable option. This was a technique I'd learned during international peacekeeping operations, where the stated positions often masked deeper concerns about security, identity, and survival. Jackson's group wasn't just interested in the medical supplies. They were trying to establish themselves as the dominant military force in the Denver area, capable of providing security in exchange for deference to their authority. The medical professionals weren't just concerned about proper distribution. They were trying to maintain their professional status and expertise in a world where traditional credentials were becoming meaningless. The families weren't just worried about their children's health. They were fighting for recognition that the needs of the most vulnerable should take priority over the preferences of the most powerful. By the third hour, I realized that we weren't negotiating about medical supplies. We were negotiating about the fundamental principles that would govern our emerging society. This was exactly the kind of constitutional moment that I'd studied in my diplomatic training. When communities have the opportunity to choose between different models of social organization, I proposed a solution that addressed each group's core concerns while establishing precedents that could guide future resource disputes. The medical supplies would be placed under the joint custody of all three groups, with distribution decisions made by a committee that included military, medical, and family representatives. Each group would contribute resources to securing and maintaining the facility according to their capabilities. Most importantly, we would establish formal procedures for resolving similar disputes in the future. The negotiation over the details took another 6 hours and involved some of the most complex multi-party bargaining I'd ever attempted. We had to work out security arrangements, distribution protocols, oversight mechanisms, and dispute resolution procedures. Every decision created precedents that would affect how the council operated going forward. But we reached agreement, and more importantly, we created a framework that could handle future resource conflicts without fragmenting into violence. The medical supply agreement became the template for what we started calling the Denver Protocols, a set of principles and procedures for governance that other survivor communities began adopting. On day 20, we faced our first test of the new system. A group of about 30 people arrived in Denver from Fort Collins, refugees from a community that had been overrun by raiders. They were exhausted, under-equipped, and desperate for shelter and supplies. Under the old informal arrangements, different council groups would have competed to recruit them or ignored them entirely. Under the new protocols, we had procedures for processing refugees and integrating them into the broader community. I was asked to lead the refugee processing team, which meant conducting interviews to assess their skills, resources, and compatibility with existing communities. It was strange to find myself on the other side of the refugee experience, making decisions about other people's fate instead of advocating for their rights. The Fort Collins group included several people with valuable skills. A veterinarian who could provide medical care when human doctors weren't available. A teacher with experience in wilderness education. A couple who had operated a solar power installation business. But they also included people who were traumatized, physically injured, or simply unable to contribute much to community survival efforts. The interviews revealed disturbing information about conditions north of Denver. Organized raider groups were systematically attacking smaller communities, not just for immediate supplies, but to force people into joining their organizations. Some communities were surrendering voluntarily, accepting subordination in exchange for protection. Others were being absorbed through violence or the threat of violence. More concerning was the pattern of these attacks. They weren't random or opportunistic. They were coordinated campaigns designed to consolidate smaller groups into larger, more hierarchical organizations. Someone was organizing a systematic transformation of the survivor community structure across the entire region. I shared this information with the council leadership that evening, and it triggered the most serious strategic discussion we'd had since forming the network. If organized raider groups were expanding south toward Denver, we needed to decide whether to resist, negotiate, or evacuate before they arrived. Jackson, predictably, argued for military resistance. His group had been preparing for exactly this scenario, and he believed the council communities could successfully defend themselves if they coordinated their security efforts. The medical professionals wanted to establish Denver as a neutral zone that would provide services to everyone regardless of their political affiliations. The family groups were mostly interested in evacuation, believing that violence would inevitably harm the most vulnerable community members. I found myself arguing for a diplomatic approach that none of the other factions had considered. Instead of waiting for the raider groups to attack us or attempting to flee before they arrived, we should make contact with them directly and explore the possibility of negotiated integration rather than violent conquest. This was a controversial suggestion, and I understood why. Negotiating with predatory groups implied legitimizing their methods and potentially collaborating with people who had harmed other communities. But I'd seen enough international conflicts to know that sometimes the only way to protect vulnerable populations is to engage with dangerous actors rather than simply opposing them. The debate continued for 3 days, with different council groups taking increasingly hardline positions. Some wanted to prepare for siege warfare. Others insisted on immediate evacuation. A few were secretly exploring the possibility of preemptive alliance with the raider groups to avoid being targeted. On day 23, the decision was made for us. We received a radio transmission from someone who identified himself only as the trader. He claimed to represent a confederation of survivor communities across Colorado, Wyoming, and Nebraska. He was offering to negotiate agreements with the council that would provide security and resource access in exchange for integration into his organization. The message was polite and professional, but the implications were clear. Join voluntarily, or be forced to join later under less favorable terms. We had perhaps a week to make our decision before his representatives arrived in Denver to begin formal negotiations. I volunteered to be part of the team that would meet with the traders' representatives, partly because I had the most relevant experience, and partly because I was deeply curious about what kind of organization was capable of coordinating activities across such a large geographic area. This wasn't just a larger version of the raider groups we'd been hearing about. This was something approaching a new form of regional government. The meeting was scheduled for day 25 at a location outside Denver that the traders' people would designate. In the meantime, I worked with the council to develop our negotiating positions and prepare for various scenarios. We needed to understand what kind of deal we could accept, what our non-negotiable requirements were, and what alternatives we had if negotiations failed. But I also used this time to make a decision about our group's future that I'd been avoiding for weeks. If the council agreed to integrate with the traders' organization, we would probably be safe but subject to external authority over our internal decisions. If the council refused and chose to fight, we would be caught in a conflict that could destroy everything we'd built. If the council fragmented with different groups making different choices, we would lose the network that had provided our security and resources. I called our group together and explained the situation as clearly as I could. We were facing a choice between three options, none of which guaranteed our survival or preserved our autonomy. We could commit to the council's collective decision, whatever it turned out to be. We could make our own independent choice based on our assessment of the risks and opportunities. Or we could accelerate our evacuation timeline and attempt to reach the southern safe zones before the situation in Denver resolved itself. The discussion that followed was the most difficult our group had ever had. Everyone understood that we were choosing between different kinds of uncertainty, and that any decision could turn out to be fatal if we guessed wrong about future developments. Maria wanted to stay with the council regardless of what they decided, arguing that our survival depended on being part of a larger community. Carlos thought we should negotiate independently with the trader, believing that our skills would make us valuable enough to get better terms than a collective agreement would provide. The Henderson family was split, with the parents wanting to head south immediately and the teenagers wanting to stay and see what happened. Stefan and Anna Kowalski surprised everyone by proposing that we split up temporarily, with some people staying to represent our interests in the Denver negotiations, and others heading south to establish connections with the refugee communities in Texas. We could make final decisions about reunion once we had better information about conditions in both locations. It was a reasonable suggestion, but it meant acknowledging that our group might not stay together permanently. After weeks of building trust and mutual dependence, the idea of separation was emotionally devastating even if it was strategically sound. I spent that evening walking around downtown Denver, trying to process the complexity of the situation we were facing. The city was transforming before my eyes as different survivor communities prepared for an uncertain future. Some buildings were being fortified for defense. Others were being abandoned as their occupants prepared to evacuate. The infrastructure that had supported a metropolitan area of millions was being adapted to serve a population of thousands organized around completely different principles. But I also saw signs of the resilience and creativity that had impressed me throughout this crisis. People were establishing gardens in abandoned lots, creating workshops in empty buildings, developing systems for education and governance that worked with the resources they actually had rather than the resources they wished they had. That night, I finally received the radio contact I'd been hoping for since the first days of the crisis. Not from Keiko directly, but from someone who knew her, a researcher at the University of Copenhagen who had been in contact with the Edinburgh team before international communications became unreliable. The news was both devastating and hopeful. Keiko's research station had been evacuated when the European climate situation deteriorated rapidly, but the evacuation had been successful, and she was believed to be in a refugee processing center in southern Spain. More importantly, her team's atmospheric research had provided crucial data that was being used to identify regions where long-term human habitation might remain viable. According to the Copenhagen researcher, there were areas in southern Europe, North Africa, and parts of South America where the climate changes would be severe but not necessarily fatal to human civilization. The key was establishing communities with appropriate technology and social organization before the most extreme conditions arrived. This information changed my entire perspective on our situation. We weren't just trying to survive the immediate crisis or find temporary refuge in southern safe zones. We were potentially part of one of the last generations that would have the opportunity to establish sustainable human communities before Earth's climate system settled into its new configuration. The skills I'd developed in international diplomacy, the experience our group had gained in community building, and the networks we'd established with other survivors weren't just survival tools. They were the foundation for whatever new form of human civilization would emerge from this crisis. On day 24, I made my recommendation to our group. We would participate in the negotiations with the trader, but we would also accelerate our preparations for evacuation to the south. We would maintain our unity as a group, but we would also develop individual contingency plans in case circumstances forced us to separate temporarily. Most importantly, we would approach these decisions not just as refugees trying to escape a disaster, but as founders of whatever communities would carry human knowledge and culture through the transition to the new climate system. Our choices over the next few days wouldn't just determine our immediate survival. They would influence the kind of world that would exist for generations to come. The blizzard that trapped us in the shopping mall was still 2 days away, but I could already see the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Day 25 brought the worst blizzard in Colorado history. We were trapped in that shopping mall with barely enough fuel to keep from freezing, and I had to make the hardest negotiation of my career. Not with world leaders, but with my own people. The storm hit just as we were supposed to meet the traders' representatives at the designated location outside Denver. Instead of diplomatic negotiations that might determine our community's future, we found ourselves huddled in an abandoned department store, watching through the windows as the wind drove snow horizontally across the parking lot at speeds that made travel impossible. Our group had taken shelter in the mall, along with about 40 other people from various council communities. What should have been a temporary refuge became a 3-day survival situation when the storm intensified beyond anything the weather services had predicted before they went offline. The temperature dropped to 20 degrees below zero, and the wind chill made it feel like 40 below. By the second day, our fuel supplies were critically low. We had enough propane and wood to keep a small heating area functional for maybe 12 more hours. After that, we would be relying on body heat and whatever combustible materials we could find in the abandoned stores. The margin between survival and death had narrowed to a few critical decisions about resource allocation. That's when the group dynamics that I'd been carefully managing for weeks finally collapsed under the pressure. People were terrified, exhausted, and facing the very real possibility that some of us weren't going to survive the next 24 hours. The cooperative spirit that had sustained us through the previous challenges evaporated as individual survival instincts took over. The first major conflict was over food rationing. We had enough supplies for everyone to eat one small meal per day for 3 days, or enough for half the group to eat normally for the same period. Some people argued that we should reduce everyone's rations equally. Others insisted that children and people with medical conditions should get priority. A few suggested that people who contributed more to group survival should receive larger portions. Maria wanted to implement medical triage principles, allocating resources based on who was most likely to survive with assistance. Carlos argued for merit-based distribution, giving more food to people whose skills were essential for keeping everyone alive. The Henderson parents wanted equal distribution regardless of age or contribution. Stefan and Anna Kowalski remained silent, but I could see they were making their own calculations about their family's interests. I realized that this wasn't really about food rationing. It was about the fundamental question of how we valued human life and what obligations we had to each other under extreme circumstances. Every ethical framework I'd studied during my diplomatic training offered different answers, and the choice we made would define what kind of community we became. I called for a group meeting in the center court of the mall, where we could all sit in a circle around one of our few remaining heat sources. I started by acknowledging what everyone already knew. We were facing a genuine survival crisis, and the decisions we made over the next few hours would determine who lived and who died. but I also reminded them of everything we'd accomplished together over the past 3 weeks. We'd successfully evacuated from a failing city, established cooperative relationships with other survivor communities, and created systems for resource sharing and mutual aid that had kept all of us alive when individual survival would have been impossible. Then I asked each person to explain not what they wanted us to do, but what they thought our decision should be based on. What principles should guide us when we had to choose between preserving individual lives and maintaining group cohesion? The conversation that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced in my diplomatic career. Instead of representatives advocating for institutional interests, these were people confronting the most fundamental questions about human nature and social responsibility. Their answers revealed not just their immediate preferences, but their deepest beliefs about what makes life meaningful and what obligations we have to each other. Sarah Henderson, who had been the most mature voice in our group discussions throughout the crisis, made an observation that reframed the entire debate. She pointed out that we were assuming we had to choose between individual survival and group survival, but that might be a false choice. What if the decision that maximized individual survival chances was the same decision that preserved group unity? Her suggestion was that we pool all our resources and make collective decisions about their use, but that individuals should be free to opt out of the group at any time if they disagreed with those decisions. People who left would take their proportional share of supplies with them, but they would also give up the benefits of group cooperation and protection. It was a brilliant solution that addressed everyone's core concerns while maintaining the voluntary nature of our association. People who wanted to prioritize their own survival could do so without forcing that choice on others. People who wanted to maintain group solidarity could commit to collective decision-making without being betrayed by defectors. But implementing this solution required renegotiating every aspect of our group's organization in the middle of a survival crisis. We had to figure out how to calculate proportional resource shares, establish procedures for voluntary departure, and maintain security for people who chose to stay. We had to do all of this while conserving energy, managing our remaining fuel supplies, and preparing for the possibility that some people would choose to leave. The negotiation took almost 6 hours and involved every mediation technique I'd learned during 15 years of international diplomacy. I had to manage personality conflicts, address underlying trust issues, and find creative solutions to problems that had no obvious answers. But gradually, we built consensus around a new set of agreements that everyone could accept. By day 26, we had what amounted to a new constitution for our group. People could participate in collective decisions and benefit from shared resources, or they could manage their own survival independently while remaining part of the larger community for mutual aid and protection. The key insight was that unity didn't require uniformity, and that people could cooperate effectively even when they had different priorities and risk tolerances. The immediate effect was that no one chose to leave the group, but several people changed how they participated in group decisions. Carlos became more involved in resource management, applying his technical skills to maximize our survival chances. Maria took charge of medical care and health monitoring, using her professional expertise to keep everyone functional under difficult conditions. The Henderson family became our specialists in outdoor survival, sharing knowledge that proved crucial for managing our situation. On day 27, the storm finally cleared enough for us to attempt radio contact with the outside world. What we learned changed everything about our understanding of the regional situation. The meeting with the traders' representatives had been postponed indefinitely because the storm had affected the entire Colorado-Wyoming area. More importantly, the council network in Denver had used the time to establish contact with survivor communities across the western United States. The picture that emerged was both more hopeful and more complex than anything we'd anticipated. Instead of isolated communities struggling for individual survival, A vast network of interconnected groups was developing from Canada to Mexico. These communities were sharing information, coordinating resource movements, and even beginning to establish trade relationships across hundreds of miles. But this network was also fragmenting into distinct regional federations with different approaches to governance, resource allocation, and relationships with whatever remained of the federal government. The Northern Alliance was forming around communities in Canada and the Northern United States that were committed to maintaining democratic principles and cooperative economics. The Southern Coalition included communities in Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico that were establishing more hierarchical structures focused on security and resource control. Most intriguingly, there were reports of an Atlantic Federation forming along the eastern seaboard that was attempting to maintain contact with European survivor communities and coordinate international responses to the climate crisis. If these reports were accurate, the breakdown of national governments was being accompanied by the emergence of new forms of international cooperation at the community level. I realized that our little group wasn't just trying to survive a local disaster. We were participating in the largest reorganization of human society in recorded history. The decisions we made about our own governance and resource allocation were part of a global process that would determine what kind of civilization emerged from the collapse of the old systems. On day 28, we established contact with the broader survivor network and learned about evacuation routes that were being coordinated across multiple communities. Instead of individual groups attempting dangerous journeys with limited resources, entire convoys were being organized with security escorts, supply caches, and communication networks that extended across state boundaries. The southern network that we'd been in contact with was part of a much larger system that included communities in Mexico and Central America. People weren't just fleeing to the southern United States. They were joining a continental migration toward regions where long-term human habitation would remain possible as the climate system stabilized. More importantly, this wasn't just a refugee movement. It was a coordinated effort to preserve human knowledge, culture, and technology during the transition to the new climate conditions. Universities, research institutions, libraries, and museums were being evacuated along with the general population. Entire industrial facilities were being relocated to areas where they could continue operating. I understood then that Keiko's atmospheric research, which had seemed like abstract academic work before the crisis, was now part of the most important scientific project in human history. Communities around the world were using climate data to identify regions where sustainable civilization could be established, and to develop technologies that would allow human society to function under the new conditions. The radio contact also brought news about international developments that put our situation in global perspective. The European survivor communities that Keiko was part of were coordinating with groups in North Africa to establish Mediterranean refugee processing centers. Asian communities were developing high-altitude settlements in regions that remained habitable despite the temperature changes. South American groups were organizing around river systems that could support agriculture under the altered weather patterns. Human civilization wasn't ending. It was transforming in ways that would have been unimaginable before the crisis, but it was adapting and finding new forms of organization that could function under the changed conditions. On day 29, our group made the decision that would define our future. Instead of choosing between staying with the council in Denver or evacuating to the southern safe zones, we would join the coordinated evacuation convoy that was being organized for early spring. We would travel not as individual refugees, but as part of a planned migration that included hundreds of communities and thousands of people. But we would also use the remaining time in Denver to contribute to the knowledge preservation efforts that were being coordinated across the survivor network. Maria would work with other medical professionals to document healthcare procedures for resource-limited environments. Carlos would help establish maintenance protocols for essential equipment. I would use my diplomatic experience to help develop governance frameworks for the new communities. The Henderson family would serve as guides and teachers for wilderness survival skills. Stefan and Anna would help coordinate communications between Polish-speaking communities that were scattered across the evacuation routes. Even little Emma would contribute by helping to preserve linguistic diversity as communities with different cultural backgrounds learned to cooperate. On the morning of day 30, as I prepared to make this final transmission, I looked out at Denver from the roof of our hotel and saw a city that was dying but also being reborn. Most of the buildings were empty and dark, but smoke was rising from the chimneys of the structures where survivor communities had established themselves. The infrastructure that had supported millions of people was being adapted to serve thousands organized around entirely different principles. Roads that had carried commuter traffic were being used by convoys of evacuees heading toward new homes. Office buildings were being converted into workshops and communal living spaces. Parks and open areas were being transformed into gardens and meeting places where different communities could coordinate their activities. I thought about my 15 years as a diplomat, preventing conflicts between countries that no longer existed in any meaningful form. The skills I developed in building trust between strangers, mediating disputes over scarce resources, and creating institutions that could manage complex international relationships had prepared me not for the world that was ending, but for the world that was beginning. The Ice Age was no longer something that was happening to us. It was the context within which we were building new forms of human community that could thrive under conditions that would have destroyed the old civilization. We weren't just surviving the collapse of the systems that had supported us. We were creating the systems that would support future generations. I spent 15 years preventing wars between countries that no longer exist. Now I'm building alliances between communities that might become the new nations. The skills are the same, but the stakes have never been higher. And if you're listening to this transmission, then maybe you're ready to learn how to negotiate with the new world too.